Introductory Algebra Homework 10 starts out with exponents. We have to keep in mind that when we have the exponent, it means I take the base times itself that many times. So negative 3 to the third means negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. My answer is negative. 3 times 3 is 9. 9 times 3 is 27. Now on your calculator, if you're going to punch it into your calculator, be sure to punch it in just like it looks. If it has parentheses, you need to use the parentheses. On the Casio calculator, you do have an x cubed button, which is way over on the right-hand side of your calculator, right underneath the on button. So you would put in parentheses, negative 3, close your parentheses, hit that x to the third button, and if you hit equals, you should get negative 27. The second one says I'm taking negative 6 and squaring it. Means I'm taking negative 6 times a second negative 6. And when I do a negative times a negative, I end up with a positive 36 for my answer. If you put this in your calculator and you don't use the parentheses, you get a negative 36 answer. We'll get to those problems later, but be careful if you are going to use your calculator that you put the parentheses around that number, or you're not going to get the right answer if your exponent is even. I prefer, again, you do it on your paper, check it with your calculator. So negative 2 to the fourth means negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives means I'm going to get a positive answer. 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 8 times 2 is 16, so positive 16 is my answer. 6 to the third power just means I'm doing 6 times 6 times 6. So 6 times 6 is 36. 36 times 6, 18, 19, 20, 21 is 216. So 6 to the third power should be 216. Whoops. Third one there. Negative 4 to the third power. Negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4. I've got 1, 2, 3 negatives. I know my answer is going to be negative. So 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4 is 64. So negative 64 would be my answer. On the second one there, I'm taking a negative 8 and squaring it. Negative 8 times a second negative 8. I've got a negative times a negative, so it ends up being positive, and 8 times 8 is 64. The next ones, we are following our order of operations with integers. We're going to have a whole lot of problems where we're doing the order of operations. So the order of operations is to do your parentheses first. Now when it says do the parentheses, it means simplify inside the parentheses so you only have one number. So we're really not going to do anything with that because there's only one number in our parentheses. Then tells us to do the exponents. Well, we don't have any exponents. Then it tells us to do multiplying and dividing from left to right. Well, right here I have a division problem. You have to decide, do you want this to be a minus in front or do you want that to be negative 6? Two different ways to think about it. If I think about that as a negative 6, negative divided by a negative gives me a positive 2. 3 plus 2 is 5. However, some people think of it this way, that this negative is not with the 6, it's a subtraction. 6 divided by negative 3 is negative 2. I then had the negative in front of that. 3 minus a negative 2, hey, gives me 3 plus 5, or 3 plus 2, gives me 3 plus 2, and 3 plus 2 is 5. So I get the same answer, I just have to be really careful with those signs. If I think of that as a negative 6, which is how I think of it, I'm doing a negative and a negative, it makes it positive. But if I don't think of the negative with the 6, I get a negative 2 with a minus sign in front, which then changes it to a positive again. forgot to put my last step, adding and subtracting, that I already did, right? I did that on the end. So, order of operations, parentheses, exponents, multiplying and dividing from left to right, adding and subtracting from left to right. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally is what I learned way back a long time ago. So if I'm looking at number 5 and I'm following my order of operations, I can't simplify inside the parentheses and I don't have any exponents. So I go to the multiplying and dividing. I do have a dividing. Here, I'm going to say this is 8 minus, and I'm going to take this much together. Negative 16 divided by negative 4. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. Then I can do my adding and subtracting. 8 minus 4 is 4, so 4 is going to be my answer. Number 6. Following my order of operations, I can't simplify inside the parentheses, and again, I don't have any exponents. So I have to do my multiplying and dividing. Here I have multiplying. I'm going just to here. So I have negative 5 minus negative 6 times 9 is negative 54. They're going to put parentheses to separate the minus and negative. If I subtract a negative, I end up adding negative 5 plus 54. A negative 5 plus a 54 is a 49. I'm going to grab my calculator here. Again, our calculator does know the order of operations. So do it on your paper, check it with your calculator. The top one, 3 minus 6 divided by, in parentheses, negative 3. Close my parenthesis and hit equal. Hey, I get 5. Now, if you're not sure if this is a minus or a negative, the Casio is not picky. Use the subtraction key if you're not sure if it's a minus or a negative. If you use this negative sign in the subtraction, it's going to give you an error. But if you use the subtraction in place of the negative, the calculator knows what you meant. If I'm going to check this one, 8 minus, in parentheses, negative 16, divided by, in parentheses, negative 4. Close my parentheses. Oh, I get 4. Yes, I do. Checking the bottom one. Negative 5 minus, in parentheses, negative 6, close my parentheses, times 9 equals 49. So I know all my answers are correct. I've checked them with my calculator, but do them paper, pencil, check them with your calculator, because I do expect to see the work on your paper. Exponents and sign fractions. So now I'm evaluating something that has parentheses, negatives on the outside, negatives on the inside, and all those various things. 2 cubed over 3 means I'm going to do 2 times 2 times 2 over just the plain 3. They're not parentheses, so that cubed only goes with the 2. 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, so 8 over 3 is my answer. Here, this one is a tricky one. Notice the negative is not in the parentheses. When there's a negative all out in front by itself, it means negative 1. Negative 1 times 5 fourths squared. So I'm going to have negative 1 times 5 fourths times 5 fourths. That negative isn't squared, just the fraction in the parenthesis is. This is going to give me a negative answer since there's only one negative sign. 5 times 5 is 25, and 4 times 4 is 16, because I know 1 times anything stays the same thing. So I'm going to end up with a negative 25/16 for my answer. And again, if you're checking it with your calculator, punch it in just like it looks. Number 8. This one. The negative is in the parentheses. So it means a negative 1/5 times a second negative 1/5. And a negative times a negative makes that a positive. 1 times 1 is 1. 5 times 5 is 25. So I get 1/25 for my answer. By the way, if you circle your answers when you're doing your homework pages, it makes it a lot easier for me to find which one you meant was the right answer. So write neatly so I can read your numbers and circle your answers. This one here, the 4 is by itself on top. The bottom I'm taking 3 cubed. 3 times 3 times 3. So I'm going to have 4 over 3 times 3 is 9. 9 times 3 is 27. 4 over 27 is going to be my answer. Number 9. 3 squared over negative 5 means I have 3 times 3 over negative 5. End up with 9 over negative 5. And 9 over negative 5, when you put your answer in, means you have a negative 9/5. Positive divided by a negative means the fraction is negative on your answer. This one again, the negative's on the outside. It means negative 1 times 2/5 cubed. So negative 1 times 2/5 times 2/5 times 2/5. I've only got one negative, which means my answer is negative. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 5 times 5 is 25. 25 times 5 is 125. So I get negative 8 over 125. Ten, 11, and 12. I'm back to my order of operations. Now I've got a much more complicated expression. These are much more difficult to do, but take your time, follow the order of operations, and see if you can get to the end. So it says, first of all, do inside the parentheses. I have a set of parentheses that says this. Just worrying about that, I still have to follow my order of operations. So I have to do my exponent before I subtract. 2 to the third is 8. 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. 1 minus 8 is negative 7. So now in the parentheses is just one number. On the outside of that I had a squared plus 5 times 4. So I've done inside the parentheses. I now have to do any exponents. Negative 7 squared means negative 7 times a second negative 7, and a negative times a negative is a positive 49. Again, if you use your calculator and you do this and this are not the same thing. Do not do that. Use the parentheses. Plus 5 times 4. Following my order of operations, now I'm going to do the multiplying and dividing. I have a multiplying. 5 times 4 is 20. So now I have 49 plus 20. I can finally do my adding and subtracting, which is 69. So, order of operations. Parentheses, exponents, multiplying and dividing from left to right, adding and subtracting from left to right. Inside my parentheses, I've got a couple different sets of parentheses. Now in this parenthesis, I only have one number. So when I'm thinking about my parentheses, I'm doing 2 minus negative 1 squared, and I'm doing that big set of parentheses. Got to do my exponent first. A negative 1 times a negative 1 is a positive 1. Just that part is 1. I have 2 minus 1, which is also 1. That's in my parentheses. There was a negative out in front. There was a squared on the outside. Then I also had this set of parentheses. In that set of parentheses, I can simplify. 8 over 2 is just the nice whole number 4. So now I've got both sets of my parentheses simplified. Next thing it says is to do the exponents. Now when I do the exponents here, I'm just squaring the 1. 1 times 1 is 1. There's that minus sign in front. Here I'm just squaring the 4. 4 times 4 is 16. There's a minus sign in front of that parenthesis. Don't have any multiplying and dividing, but now I can do my adding and subtracting. Negative 1 minus 16, I add and keep my sign. So negative 17 is my answer. Again, these ones get to be difficult, and we'll check these last couple on the calculator in a minute, but we're going to do them first. So number 12, following my order of operations, parentheses. There's only one number in this parenthesis, so I'm not going to worry about that. This only has one number, but I have that bigger set of parentheses. I have negative 2 squared minus 3 inside those parentheses. Following my order of operations, I have to do the squaring first. Negative 2 squared is 4. 4 minus 3 is 1. So there's a cube down the outside, a minus in front, and negative 3 times negative 5 in front of that. Following my order of operations, I have to do my exponent. I am just cubing the 1 there. 1 times 1 times 1 is still 1. So this is 1. Now following my order of operations, I have to multiply. Negative 3 times a negative 5 is a positive 15. So now I have 15 minus 1. 15 minus 1 is 14. 14 is then my answer. So I'm grabbing my calculator. I'm going to punch this in as close to possible as it looks as possible. So minus sign in front, or negative, parentheses. 2 minus, in parentheses, negative 1, close my parentheses. That set of parentheses is squared. Close my parenthesis again. That set of parentheses is squared. Minus, in parentheses I have a fraction, 8 fraction 2. Close my parentheses. That set of parentheses is also squared. Hit equals. My calculator says negative 17. Hey! Number 12. Negative 3 times, whoops, I'm going to clear, there we go, negative 3 times, in parentheses, negative 5, close my parenthesis, minus 2 parentheses, so parenthesis, parenthesis, negative 2, close my parentheses, squared, minus 3, close my parentheses, cubed. Hit equals. 14 is what I should get. The only thing you need to watch out for is if you have a complicated fraction, say you have 3 times negative 2 to the 4th plus 1 over 5 divided by 5 plus 3 to the 3rd, or something like that. If you have a big long fraction like this, you have to do the top and find an answer first, do the bottom, find that answer, and then simplify your fraction. Same thing if you're going to use your calculator. You can't punch that all into your calculator at once. You have to do the top separately from the bottom, and then if you can simplify your fraction, you would. So just a note there, do them on your paper, check them with your calculator, and if you don't get the same answer, check. Did I type it in wrong, or did I do something wrong following my order of operations? Number 13, 14, evaluate. So I'm going to evaluate my expression. Now again, we talked about exponents before. When that negative is in front, that negative is not in with the squaring. What this means is negative 1 times 6 squared. So I'm going to write it as negative 1 times 6 times 6. It is not negative 6 times negative 6 because there's not parentheses. If I multiply that out, I only have one negative. I'm going to end up with a negative answer, negative 36. Where this one is the ones we did before. This one, the negative is in the parentheses, so it means negative 7 times the second negative 7. And a negative times a negative gives me a positive answer. Number 14, if I'm doing negative 5 to the 3rd, the negative is in the parentheses. It means negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. 1, 2, 3 negatives. It's going to be negative. 5 times 5 is 5, and 5 times 5, or 5 times 5 is 25, and 25 times 5 is 125. So negative 125 should be my answer. On this one, notice there are not parentheses. If there's not parentheses, this means negative 1 times 3 to the 4th power. So it means negative 1 times 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. There is only one negative. My answer is negative. 3 times 3 is 9. 9 times 3 is 27. 27 times 3 is 81. Number 15. Again, I've got that negative sign in front of my 6 to the 3rd. It is not in parentheses. It means negative 1 times 6 to the 3rd. So negative 1 times 6 times 6 times 6. There is only one negative sign. My answer is negative. 6 times 6 is 36. 36 times 6 we did earlier was 216. This one, the negative is in the parentheses. It means negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. There's 1, 2, 3 negatives. My answer is going to be negative, and 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. So negative 8 is my answer. So be very careful with that negative sign. If it's not in the parentheses, it only counts as one negative. If it is in the parentheses, then I have it that same number of times as the exponent. Operations with absolute values. When I do absolute values, I have to simplify inside the absolute value so that there's only one number in the absolute value before I remove the absolute values. So in this case, I have to do 5 minus 15 first, which is negative 10. So I have the absolute value of the absolute value of negative 10 minus the absolute value of negative 12, all in the big set of absolute value signs. Next, I can then get rid of the absolute value signs. The absolute value of negative 10. How far is negative 10 from 0? Negative 10 is 10 places from 0. Absolute value of negative 12. How far is a negative 12 from 0? Negative 12 is 12 places from 0. There's the minus sign between those, the absolute values on the outside. Again, I simplify inside here first. 10 minus 12 is negative 2. I then get rid of my absolute value signs. What's the absolute value of a negative 2? Well, it's a positive 2. So 2 ends up being my answer when I evaluate that expression. Number 17. We have the absolute value of 5 minus the absolute value of 4 minus 7. I have to simplify that into one number first. 4 minus 7 is negative 3. So I have the absolute value of 5 minus the absolute value of a negative 3. I'm then going to simplify my absolute values. How far is 5 from 0? It's 5 places. How far is negative 3 from 0? It's 3 places. There's a minus sign in between. My problem becomes 5 minus 3. Notice we didn't have the extra set of absolute values. 5 minus 3 is 2. 2 is going to be my answer. Number 18, I'm going to evaluate. Again, I've got to start inside my absolute values. 4 minus 12 is negative 8. So I've got absolute value of negative 8 minus the absolute value of negative 9, all in the absolute value symbols. Absolute value of negative 8 is 8. Absolute value of negative 9 is 9. Minus sign is in between. 8 minus 9, negative 1. What is the absolute value of negative 1? Well, it's positive 1, because negative 1 is 1 place from 0 on the number line. So just be sure you simplify inside first, get rid of your absolute values, and then finish out your problem. properties of addition. We have 4 properties of addition that we're going to talk about: the commutative property, associative property, additive identity, and additive inverse. First property is the commutative property. The commutative property says I can change the order of my numbers. 2 plus 3 is the same thing as 3 plus 2. They're going to say something like x plus y can equal y plus x. I just switched the order of my expression. On here, 8 plus x equals x plus 8. That's my commutative property. I'm just going to put a 1 in the box. You could write it out if you want to. On Alex, you'll have a drop down and you'll pick which is the right one of the 4 properties. Associative property says the order has to be the same, but the parentheses are moved. An association is a group. You have to use grouping symbols, which are parentheses. So if there's not parentheses in the problem, it's not going to be the associative property. Associative property says x plus y plus z has to equal x plus y plus z. On one of them, I'm going to have parentheses around the first 2. On the other side, the parentheses are going to be moved. So it's going to have 2 different things in the parentheses. Here I have an x and a y. Here I have a y and a z. My associative property, I moved the parentheses. I did not change the order. Additive identity property. When you think of your identity, you want to think about like looking in the mirror. What I start with should be the same thing I'm looking at, right? So if I'm going to add something to 3 and still get 3, I would add a 0 to it. My additive identity property says if I add 0 to something, it's not going to change its value. So the example is going to be something like x plus 0 equals x. I added 0 in that problem. Additive inverse. Oh, I better do that one. Here, we got one. We have one with the additive identity. We didn't have a commutative. Additive identity, we added 0. B plus 0 is still B. So that's my third property, the additive identity property. Fourth property, additive inverse property. Inverse means opposite. When I add a positive and a negative of the same value, 3 plus negative 3, I always get an answer of 0. So when I add opposites, x plus negative x, I always end up with an answer of 0. So this is an example here of my additive inverse property. 7 plus a negative 7 gives me an answer of 0. There's my additive inverse property. So number 20, we have 6 plus 7 plus b, 7 plus b plus 6. So a lot of people will look at that right away and say, oh, it's got parentheses. It has to be the associative property. It is not the associative property, because the associative property says the order must remain the same and what's in my parentheses is different. Here I have a 7 plus b and here I have a 7 plus b. The stuff in the parentheses is the same. What did they do? They switched the order. They have the 6 first here and they got the 6 last here. That's actually going to be your commutative property, where I've changed the order of my values. The next one, I look at that and I say, oh, they added 0. That's my big clue. If I add 0 to anything, I get the same thing. Additive identity is when I add 0 to something. Now I look at the next one. It kind of looks like that top one, but look. I have 8 plus a plus 4, 8 plus a plus 4. The order of everything is the same. The 8, the a, then the 4. But here I have the a plus 4 in parentheses. Here the 8 plus a is in parentheses. I've got 2 different things in the grouping symbols. That's my associative property. So you want to be careful, because sometimes they try to be tricky and make you think, oh, it's got parentheses, it's the associative property. But with the associative property, the order must be exactly the same, and then what's in the parentheses is different. So we're going to do one last one here, at least of the properties, and we're going to pick out what properties we have. So 3 plus 7 equals 7 plus 3. They've just switched the order around. Commutative property. 9 plus x plus 2 equals 9 plus x plus 2. My order's the same. Here the parentheses are on the 9 plus x. Here it's around the x plus 2. I've changed what's in my parentheses. That's my associative property. Here I'm taking a b plus a negative b. I'm getting 0. I'm adding opposites, which is my additive inverse property. Number 4. If you have trouble with the properties, look on the front page to see what number sheet I have. Go to the resources and find Linda's note sheets. It will have more words instead of just the examples, which might make it a little easier. And the last 3 here, we are evaluating expressions, integer multiplication with addition or subtraction. In this case, this means -7 times the b value plus the a value. When I substitute in for a variable, I put the value in parentheses. So I'm going to take -7 times the b value. The b value is -5. I'm going to add the a value, which happens to be a 7. Now, since this is a plain 7, I really didn't need the parentheses, but it doesn't hurt to put them there. You could punch this into your calculator just like it looks, but we like to practice our order of operations. -7 times -5 is 35. 35 plus my 7 is 42. So 42 would be my answer. Number 23. I have a negative in front of the a. Technically it means -1 times a, but I'm going to have negative in front of my a, which I'm going to put in parentheses. Well, that's the same thing as that, right? Then I have plus 8 times -4. Here, again, I'm thinking this is a positive times a negative. A positive times a negative is a -32. I don't really need a plus. I could put plus -32, it's the same thing, but I know that when I add, there's a negative in front of both of those. I need to add and keep the sign. -4 minus 32 is -36. So the key, especially if you're checking with your calculator, is be sure when you substitute in to put that value in parentheses. Sometimes they're really not needed, but it doesn't hurt to put them there, and it is going to give you the correct answer then. 2 times x, 2 times 4, minus the c value. The c value happens to be -2. 2 times 4 is 8. When I subtract a negative, when we subtract a negative, we end up adding. So we end up adding 8 plus 2. 8 plus 2 gives me an answer of 10. So 2 times 4 minus a -2 gives me 8 plus 2, which is 10. All right, those are the next few things on that homework page. Go ahead and check your pie chart, see if you have any of those to do.